by giving a brief resume of the second session that was held yesterday afternoon. As you remember, I had started out in the very beginning of the seminar to give you an outline of the Hindu mythology of the nature of the universe. And then I went on in the second session to give an outline of the equivalent Christian mythology, which to some extent includes the Hebrew. And we saw that it had certain very, very distinctive and important features. First of all, that whereas in the Hindu world view, the creation is the dismemberment, the voluntary dismemberment of the Creator, in the Christian and the Hebrew worldview, what is dismembered is not the Creator. The Creator remains eternally separate from the creation, and I explained it by the analogy, which indeed is the biblical analogy, of manufacture, pottery specifically. Adam is formed out of the clay, and so whereas the Hindu will say tattvam asi, that art thou, where that means the ultimate that, the which than which there is no whicher, a Christian is told every Ash Wednesday, remember, O man, that dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. Except that by the grace of God, and only by the grace of God, there may be salvation. May be. So the tremendously important feature upon which the whole of the Christian worldview is based is, you could call it really 3 points, and they are all to do with distinctions. The eternal distinction of the Creator from the creature, of God from man. The eternal distinction of good and evil. These do not resolve themselves into an opposite. The devil is malice, but his malice is overruled. It is not a case of Persian dualism, as between Ormuzd, the principle of light, and Ahriman, the principle of darkness. The malice of the devil is always under the control of the divine. It is allowed because freedom is allowed. But if freedom gets out of hand, in the end it is overruled, and the devil is consigned everlastingly to the torments of hell with all his angels and the human beings he has managed to pervert. Except that by the grace of God, and only by the grace of God, there may be salvation. May be. So the tremendously important feature upon which the whole of the Christian worldview is based is, you could call it really 3 points, and they are all to do with distinctions. The eternal distinction of the Creator from the creature. So that distinction between good and evil is a very important, firm feature of Christianity. It's a completely serious distinction. That is to say, the God is not acting his part, and the devil is not acting his part. They really mean it. And the third principle is an equally eternal distinction between persons. Just as you and I are not God, so by the same measure you and I are not each other. We are all distinct, and we are all important in the eyes of God, on the principle that just as a sparrow doesn't fall to the ground without the Father in heaven being aware of it, that means that every sparrow is important. So, to a much greater measure, every human being is important, immeasurably important, in the eyes of the Godhead. And so, this constitutes, as it were, the basic distinction, the basic feature of all the theistic religions, of Judaism in the first place, of Christianity in the second, and Islam in the third. Then I went on to explain, again in a sort of outline, the fact that Christianity consists above all things of a story. The story of the fall of the angels, followed by the fall of man, a perversion of the substance of the universe, that is to say, a perversion of the very clay from which all things are made, so that it has, as it were, a flaw or fault in it. I tried to show what the fall really consists in so far as man is concerned, which is pride. The original sin is not, as some people suppose, sexual intercourse. It is pride. It is taking the control of the world into one's own hands instead of being spontaneous, instead of simply trusting and acting like we suppose the animals to act and we suppose children to act on impulse. Once you start controlling, you are in the position of the sorcerer's apprentice. You've got to go on. And so we now witness mankind frantically endeavoring to control the amazing things that result from his technology and from his cleverness. The atomic bombs, the population explosion, the erosion of the soil, the proliferation of smog, the falling of the water table, the messing up of all bacteriological entities by penicillin, and heaven only knows what. And we are fighting to control that, you see. And we are learning the lesson at last. So that was the fall. And then I went on to try and describe the most difficult part of Christianity, which is what it means to say that the world is saved by Jesus Christ. And you hear some preacher hold forth about Jesus saves. Are you saved, brother? And we are saved by the blood of the Lamb, by the crucifixion of Christ on the cross. All this is sheer gobbledygook to most people. They haven't the faintest idea what it means, and nor have the preachers. But they think, you know, like a man like Billy Graham, who goes around with this and moves huge audiences. But he never explains what it is. He just says, believe it, and then you'll find it changes your behavior. But you see, if you're blessed or cursed with a critical intellect, you just can't swallow that. It just won't do. So then, I tried to explain the doctrine of the incarnation, that is, the idea that in the historical appearance of Jesus Christ in the world, God became man. That is to say, the divine united itself with the human and with all the aspects of human life, with its birth, with its problems, with its suffering, and finally with its death. And so this union achieved a new start for the human race. And therefore, through the gift, as it were, of love or grace or union with God to the human race, everybody is enabled to appropriate that gift. But you see, the gift is given to your substance and not to your person. That's the distinction I underlined. In Christian terminology, the person means the ego, the will. And the substance is, as it were, the stuff out of which you're made, as pots are made of clay. All right, so the substance has now been rendered flawless. But it's up to you to appropriate that flawlessness by a voluntary act. And here's the nub. The nub is how, under the former problem for the Jew, under the dispensation of the law and the prophets, was how am I to acquire a pure heart? How am I to obey the law in pureness of heart? To have, to use Jeremiah's phrase, the law written in my inward parts. How am I to do that? And everybody who knows himself through and through finds out that he can't do that. He can't be spontaneous on purpose. And so, in Christianity, the same problem arises again in a far more crucial form. It says, you can obey the law. You can be a saint if you've got the power and the grace of God. Now, how do you get that? Well, you have to believe in Jesus Christ. You have to believe that all this is true, that God really did become man in Jesus Christ, and you've got to believe that. So you ask yourself, do I really believe it? And you think, you know, there's something uncertain about this, like St. Augustine's prayer, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. You see? And so there's always this little worm at the center of things, where you know and become conscious of a certain element of irreducible rascality in you that lies at the very core of the will.